I'm a retired professor of English at the State University of New York. University of New York at Old Westbury here on Long Island, where I taught for 38 years. For the past 3 decades, I've been translating from my mother tongue, Kannada. Some of my published translations include prominent Kannada writers such as U.R. Anantamurthy, A.K. Ramanujan, and so on. Most recently, my translation of Anantamurthy's, one of his major novels, was published by HarperCollins. And at present, I'm part of a 5-member team translating the 15th century Kannada epic called Kumaravyasa Bharata, which is scheduled to be published by Harvard University Press. Now, before I introduce today's only panelist, there were supposed to be 2 panelists. Jenny Bhatt, who has translated a prominent Gujarati writer called Dhumketu. Unfortunately, she met with an accident just 2 days ago, so she can't join us. So it's now entirely Tamraparni Dasu's show.
Yes.
Tamraparni Dasu wears many hats. She has a PhD in mathematical statistics from the University of Rochester, and was a research scientist at AT&T Bell Lab for 31 years, yes, where she conducted research in computational statistics and data streams. Along with her father, about whom we will talk a little bit, her father, Professor Dasu Krishnamurthy, in 2006, she founded the literary non-profit organization called India Writers Publishers, Inc., which is a non-profit organization. And Dasu has also written books of fiction on her own. She is working on her 3rd novel at the moment. Now, we will be primarily discussing the stories collected under the title of The Greatest Telugu Stories Ever Told. A somewhat intriguing title. I'm going to ask her how you determine which stories are the greatest ever told. But then I came to realize that this is the publisher's series called The Greatest whatever language ever told. So I don't think she had much choice in that. Anyway, my question to begin with is the collection has about 26 or 27 stories, 21 stories, yeah. You must have shifted through so many hundreds of stories.
Yes.
What is the rationale for your selection? What are the criteria? What considerations have gone into choosing these 21 stories? Would you please talk about that?
Oh, absolutely. So, as Narayan mentioned, my father and we sifted through more than 100 stories, and this is our second anthology. Our first anthology was published by Rupa. And during the process, obviously you can't choose just 21 stories. So each anthology had a theme. So for this anthology, the theme was we were looking for what you can think of as agents of change. And agents of change with a focus on minority voices. Because if you think about it, our familiarity with writers in English, it's typically, people who write about urban concepts with a Western education, and they're catering to a different audience. But the writers in local languages, they address very different issues. And they come from, the heartland, the hinterland of the country, and their voices are very different. They talk about very different topics. So when we were choosing stories for this book, we were looking for stories and writers who focused on social change, whether it is in terms of voices of women or challenging traditions. So we focused on the voices of minorities, women, Muslims, Dalits. So these communities who did not have a voice earlier, either because of traditional patriarchy or whatever values that were there. So this volume focused on minority writers who focused on bringing agents of change. And so we actually had a list of around 27 stories, and we submitted all the 27 stories to LF, and they selected the 21 out of these.
Out of
27 stories, correct.
Okay.
Correct, yes. And if I could just elaborate on that a little bit. So there's 21 stories in here, and you can roughly think of them as they start in the early 1900s. So not only did we want agents of change, we also wanted kind of a representative or sampling of Telugu short stories. And if you think about it, the short story is a very natural form of storytelling, because we don't kind of recite novels to each other. We recite anecdotes, we recite stories. So the short story is a very natural form of storytelling, and it has been there forever. So in this book, we wanted a representative sample from the early 1900s to the current. So that was also one of our things.
And it's chronologically arranged, right?
Yes. So the publisher arranged it by the date of birth of the writers, and so they arranged it chronologically. And it's interesting because if you read it in that way, you'll see the change in the form of the story writing as well. So in the beginning, it's very formal. It's almost like a theater play, and people speak in very formal ways to each other. And as you go through the selection and go towards the end, you'll see them becoming more contemporary and more informal in the way they talk about these stories. And so there's an amazing range in collection, and it's only when I started working with my father, I realized, how much, even though they're all Telugu speakers, there are so many different regions and so many different dialects. So the variety and diversity of thought as well as themes of these stories is quite amazing.
Tell us a little bit more about the short stories scene in Telugu literature, historically speaking.
Right. So, the short stories have been there forever, but according to history, the earliest known short story is by a woman called Bandaru Achamamba, and it was written in 1902. And so our previous anthology actually featured her story. It's called Stridhanam, or The Wealth of a Woman. And this is about a very traditional, very old-fashioned woman. And her husband wants her to, she knows how to read and write her name, but nothing beyond that. And her husband is traveling away, and he says, if you knew how to read and write, you could write letters to me. And she is very much opposed to it because she says that, this is not the role of a woman, I should not be doing this. But he says, how else are you going to communicate with me? I'm going to be away for a while. So she finally gives in and learns how to read and write so that she can communicate with her husband. And so this was a part of a movement which started in around, continued with during the independence movement, and there were a lot of women who actually spoke about at that time women's rights, education for women, women taking a greater part in society. And so that was the earliest known story. And the format also has been changing, as we just mentioned.
You start with Chalam.
Yes.
Would he be a contemporary of the person that you were talking about?
Probably around 20 to 30 years later. 20 to 30 years later, or maybe even more later. And Chalam was actually known for the first time, usually the stories were very, very traditional, very conventional, and there was no mention of any no allusion to physical activities. So he was the first one who not only advocated for, at that time, so the story is called Madiga Pilla, which is about this Madiga girl. At that time, there was a lot of this untouchability, caste system, no mixing among castes, and so on. So in this story, he not only, he rejected all these, obviously, and he speaks about this girl, and he speaks in very sensual terms about her body, the way she moves, and how the narrator of the story is kind of enamored by her physical beauty. He's married, his wife is going to have like 5th or 6th baby, but he's so enamored of this beautiful woman, and he talks about her waist, her hips, and he gives a very physical and sensual description, and which is very unusual in those days.
Would you care to read the opening of this short story?
Oh, okay. I was actually not prepared for that particular one, but I'm happy to read it.
There is a point that is relevant here.
Okay.
The way he opens the story.
Yes, and so the story is about this. He's I guess a middle-level worker somewhere, and he's married to this woman who was once upon a time beautiful. Of course, now she has 6 children, and he goes to her village during one of his breaks, and he is kind of
the tone in which he introduces his marital status.
Yes. So I'm going to read the first paragraph. So it says, "It was December vacation when, without telling anyone, I traveled to my wife's village to see how she was doing after I'd impregnated her for the 6th time in the 8 years of our marriage." People in the village give the impression that they have nothing more to do on earth other than wait for their end. The fragrance of dew-drenched hay, the greenness of the crop, the freshness of grass underneath, and the music of the carefree birds holds you in thrall, like the memories of your ancestors who have left you behind.
This is mind-boggling. It's a sort of a self-deprecating, sarcastic tone about himself, about his own marriage, about his own wife. Then the entire story is sort of revealing his own hypocritical attitude towards his own life, and then his attraction to this untouchable girl.
Yes, and the beauty of this story is not only the beauty of the girl, but also the verdant setting. The imagery he creates of these, lush coconut groves, embankments, canals, and the interaction of this girl's beauty with all the nature over there, and how it literally drives him mad with desire. He knows he's married. He knows he shouldn't be messing around with this girl. And at the same time, he's kind of very judgmental about, she says, this is how I have to make a living because, I have been abused by so many people in my life. This is the only way if I want to sustain my family and my life. This is the only way I can make my living is by sleeping with people. And he suddenly becomes very judgmental because he thought that, she was in love with him. He had this whole fantasy about romance. And so when he finds out that she wants money for it, he realizes how sordid it is. And he suddenly becomes very judgmental and steps back. The hypocrisy of it, like Narayan said, yes.
And you started talking about what went into the process of selecting these stories. And you have paid considerable attention to the marginalized section, writers. And you have quite a few stories by or about Dalit writers.
Yes.
And what I was quite struck with was your inclusion of a substantial number of Muslim writers.
Yes, yes.
My guess is that Andhra, being formerly ruled by a Muslim ruler,
Yes.
the Muslims, part of the society is quite prominent.
Yes.
But talk about the variety of the issues that these Muslim writers
Yes.
address.
Yes. So just to kind of go back to the two Dalit writers who are featured in this book, one is Boya Jangaya, who passed away, I think, 2-3 years ago. And the other person is Jajula Gauri. She is amazing because she's very young, and she's a current congresswoman in the state of Telangana, and she is also an activist. And so they've written two stories. The Boya Jangaya story is about this poet who is he's a very popular poet, but he's on his way to prison for rabble rousing and creating a revolution. And he stops off at the village, at his traditional village, at his ancestral village, and he recollects this incident where his parents, who were very, very poor, were humiliated, and their last remnants of, they just had like one cow, which was their only means of survival. And what happens is this little boy, this is the poet himself, he wanders into the temple by mistake because he's curious. People say, oh, here is God. God is in this sanctum sanctorum. So he wanders into the temple, and immediately all the upper caste priests and everybody, of course, is offended, and they drag the parents into the town square and take away whatever little they have to offer, and the parents and the boy leave the village. And so he's reminded of all that happened to his parents in that village at that time. The second story, Jajula Gauri, it's about the government has all these provisions for
Uplift.
To uplift, yes.
Uplift of the...
For upliftment of, but it is not really possible to take advantage of them because there is so much bureaucracy around it. And it's about this poor woman who wants her son to get the scholarship in 4th grade so he can study, and how many signatures she has to get, and each signature requires bribing. So it's about what stands in the way of this upliftment and of this is the bureaucracy, the bribery, and so it is not easy. Even though the government provides all these, it's still not easy to get access to those resources.
Yeah. And also, again, Muslim writers concerned.
Yeah.
There are stories here by Muslim writers who are critical of certain entrenched customs among Muslims themselves, like parda, and like talaq.
Yes. So
that is quite a bold
kind
of
because correct, absolutely. And so that is the agents of change that we were looking for when we were including these stories. And so the talaq story that Narayan was referring to is in our previous book, and that's a very interesting story too, because it's about this young couple and Muslim couple, and the husband wants the wife to take part in a play with him, and they are enacting this play in front of the whole Muslim community. All the elders are there, and in the play he says talaq, talaq, talaq to his wife. And the mullahs immediately say, you have divorced your wife, you can't live together anymore, and you have divorced your wife in front of all of us. And so it's that, and it's a reflection on that. And in this, there is a story called Parda. And the interesting thing is that the writer, he uses an old woman as a protagonist. So this old woman, she has brought up her son against all odds. I mean, she's done all kinds of drudgery, and now this guy is respectable. And so he's living in this house, and he wants his daughter to marry. But the thing is, because he wants his daughter to marry into the middle class of the Muslim community, he espouses all these traditions like parda, so his daughters can't come out. And this poor lady, I mean, she kind of keeps...
How old is she in the story?
She's the story or in the story?
Yeah,
she's probably around 70, 75, something like that. She has grandchildren. And so the wife of the daughter-in-law keeps telling her, you have to adjust this parda properly every time you go out. Otherwise, if somebody gets a glimpse of the daughter inside, nobody's going to marry her. And so then she becomes very ill, and she wants to go and get treated for it, but she's had this big fight with her daughter-in-law and the son over this parda. And so she goes to the doctor on her own. She has some heart issue. The doctor gives her some medicine, and she comes trudging back home, and she's not wearing the scarf. She's just kind of slung it on her shoulder like a towel. And so the son has a conniption, and he says, I'm trying to, get my daughter married off here, and here you are, shamelessly walking around without a shawl around you, without a thing on your head. So she just lets loose, and she says, you know what, I don't know how I brought you up to have all these kind of outdated notions. Respectability doesn't mean that you have to live behind a parda. And then she kind of trudges off and says, I'm going to go live in my village, I don't care for you anymore. So what is interesting is that it is this old woman who has these more rational contemporary issues, and this is the son who's espousing all these traditions. And we see that too now, right? We see that people are kind of reverting to some pretty weird traditions in the name of trying to bring them back in the name of religion, in the name of respectability.
Thank you. You have 21 stories by different authors, 21 authors, beginning with the beginning of this 20th century, probably.
Right.
And all the way to the contemporary writers.
Right.
Do you have any favorite ones? Or
Yes.
favorite stories or favorite author?
I have both. I have favorite stories and favorite authors, but I'll talk about the favorite stories first, and for different reasons, So there's one story which, as a mother, it is this story by, where is it? I'm looking for the name here. By Muhammad Qadir Babu. It's called A Mother's Grief. And this is just a heartbreaking story. It's about this lady. So the opening scene is very powerful, So the opening scene is that all these people are coming to this home from different places, and they're coming for the funeral of a young man. And they are trying, and you see that all these arrangements are going on. They're, bringing the coffin, they're going to wrap him. But before they can actually take him to the burial ground, the mother has to absolve him of the debt he owes his mother, because he has, it is her milk that has given him life. So, but she has to say, you don't owe me any debt. And so she has to absolve him of that debt, mother's debt. And the story slowly comes out that the reason he died is because of poverty, right? There was hardly any money, and the mother was pushing him to, he's like 17 or 18 years old. She was pushing him to go to work, even though he was coughing, even though he was not well. And she didn't want to take him to the TB sanatorium because it would cost him money. So she kept pushing him to take all these like natural, this dawa, that dawa, and so on. And she ends up, he is no more now. And she says, how can I do this? I did this to him. And her daughter is absolutely brutal in her assessment. And she says, you did this to him. You killed him. And so, the scene is it sets so well, the scene of people coming in, how they're preparing it, and how this woman is just absolutely devastated, and how her husband literally has to prop her up to go and see the boy and basically say, I absolve you of this. So this is one of the most powerful stories I read, particularly as a mother. It really got to me. And then there's another story by, he's also Dada Hayat.
Yes.
And it's the opposite of that, because it's about a little kid. He is 4 or 5 years old. He's in kindergarten, and he doesn't want to go to school. And it's written so beautifully from the perspective of this little child, the way he cajoles his mother to, I don't want to go to school, and how he spends the afternoon. And then he gets bored because his sister is away at school. His dad is away, and it's just he and his mother, and he gets really bored. So this kind of transition from this anticipation and from this joy of being able to skip school, and then kind of really getting bored and feeling jealous of his friends who are playing at, during the interval, and the teacher is saying, so it's a really, really sweet story. So I like that one too.
I agree with
Yes.
you. Speaking of favorite authors, there are quite a few contemporary authors.
Yes.
Did you know any of them or some of them, and did they have any role in the translation process?
Yes. So interestingly, you should ask that question, because there is a writer called P. Satyavati, and she has won the Sahitya Academy Award for translation, I think 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And she's a very good friend of my father's. She was also a journalist, and she's actually coming for lunch next week to our house. So she has actually been very helpful, because she's very connected. She lives in Vijayawada. She's very connected to the writers' community. So she's been very helpful in putting us in touch with writers. And one of the things that we did, our nonprofit set up, one of the reasons why we set up the nonprofit was every writer that we translated, we paid them. So we paid them from our own funds from a nonprofit. So she helped us actually get the word out. She helped us find the writers, because many of them are not digitally savvy. They don't have emails. They might have a phone number. Now it's a little bit better because everybody has WhatsApp. But around 5 years ago, it was next to impossible to get hold of them. So you actually had to easily know somebody who lived in their town, so she was actually very helpful with that. And she herself is a writer, and she's a writer with a feminist bent of mind. And she has written many stories of how the perception of women has to change over time, because otherwise everything, your life is literally controlled from the time you're born by your father, by your brother, by your husband, and so on. So she's a feminist writer, and all her stories kind of talk about that. She was featured in our previous anthology, not in this one.
Well,
yes.
The reason I ask this question is sometimes knowing, as a translator, knowing the author can be a disadvantage.
Yes.
Because they have something to say about
yes.
the translation.
Yes.
Anyway, since this is a collaboration between the father and the daughter, I'm curious to know how you collaborated, what role each of you played in selection, and did you divide the certain stories among yourselves?
Yes.
Talk about it. And then also, this is the time for you to tell us about your fathers who couldn't be here for
yes.
Health reasons.
Yes. So my father, he's 96 years old, and he has only like 5% of his vision and 10% of hearing. So he is very frail. And I think there's only like 3 or 4 people he can communicate with, because he recognizes our voices. Oh. My husband, my son, my mother-in-law, and me. So, but his brain is sharp as ever, and I was talking to him yesterday, and it was like a master class in, history and everything. So he was a journalist. He worked for all the national dailies. He worked for Times of India, Indian Express, Patriot. And he also wrote for All India Radio. He was he covered foreign affairs for them. But most of his writing was political commentary about, like media watchdogs. So media and politics were his big thing. So my mother passed away 21 years ago, and my father came to live with us. And he was, devastated because I'm the only child, so there was no other choice for him but to live with us. And, he was suddenly taken away and removed from his environment, his culture, his friends, his siblings. And so he was quite distraught, and we needed something for him to kind of focus on. So he started and at that time, our son was very young. He was like 10 years old or 11 years old. And we wanted him to know more about Telugu literature and Telugu writers. So we thought that this is a good opportunity. And so I suggested to my father, why don't we kind of start translating some of these stories, mostly to kind of keep him occupied. But, with the typical energy my father has, he said, okay, let's start a magazine. So we started an online magazine where we started publishing for free these translated pieces. And so that's how we kind of got into translation. And over the years, I think we've translated so many stories, and I think it really is the reason that kind of he has kept going forward. And now he's like writing his own stories, he's written his autofiction. So I think that's the main reason that kind of keeps him connected and gives him the reason to go on. So the way we chose the stories were, he and I have different tastes, I have to say, So my father has a proclivity towards, maybe it's because of all the grief that he's going through, but he likes stories about death. He likes stories which features quite prominently both in this book as well as in the previous anthology. He likes, stories of, some of them are very dark. So when we chose stories, he would read, we would kind of split them between the two of us. So I would read 5 and he would read 5, and we'd come together. And inevitably, all his stories would be about, death and grief and misery. And I would like all these other more happier stories. So we had to kind of discuss and come to an understanding of these. So what we would do is we would select 2 stories or 3 stories, and he would take a first pass over them. And then I would take a second pass where I would compare the original with the English translation, and we would sit and discuss and say, this doesn't look right, or this word doesn't. I mean, it's a discussion. It's not like, I'm correcting him or he's correcting me. It's a discussion. And once we have that, it takes at least around 10, 12, 15 passes before you can actually get it to kind of flow smoothly and kind of capture the tone and the resonance of the original. And it's always, as a translator, Narayan knows how tricky that is to capture the mood and the tone. And like yesterday, Daisy Rockwell in her session, it's very onomatical, her translation, because in the original there is this music and she's able to capture that in English, and that is absolutely amazing. And there were some stories, particularly one called Festival of Love in this book, which is a very evocative and very atmospheric story with jasmine fields and rain drizzling. And so that translation was very challenging. And so that required a lot of discussion between my father and I, that Festival of Love. And the other thing, of course, is I think there's a temptation to editorialize because you feel that this is awful or this is not how it should be. So that is to be resisted at all costs because you have to be faithful to what the writer said. And the other thing is, there are stories that have flaws, not flaws, but some kind of a disconnect, and you know that it's going to work much better if you just insert like this little paragraph, which will be such a nice transition, it'll make it, you can't do that. So those are the things that we discuss and debate, and personally for me, you know, when my father came to live with us, he was, I won't say he was a stranger to me, but I was absolutely attached to my mother. So I had no place in my mind, you know, I was with her all the time. She was my friend. And so my father, I know he's the one who was like, education, you know, my daughter she has to study, you know. And my mother tried to kind of say, oh, you have to get married. And my father said, no. So, but I really did not know him that well as a person. So over these 21 years, I think I'm very lucky that I got this opportunity to work with him and to know him better and understand, you know, what goes on in his head and, you know, the world, how much he knows. And, you know, we take our parents for granted, you know, parents, what do they know? So, but it's just amazing. So that for me is a very, especially for an only child, it's been, you know, the fact that he's been here and I've got to collaborate with him has been awesome. So.
It is.
Yeah.
Evidently, it has been a fruitful
Yes.
collaboration.
Yes, but I should say, you know, he's pretty persistent and he can be bullying me and, you know, so I have to, sometimes my husband Kumar has to step in and, you know, he has to say, it's okay, you take a break, you don't need to do everything he tells you to do. So, yes.
I would like to make a transition to the subject of translation itself. In fact, a number of panels this time in this literary festival dealt with the subject of translation.
Correct.
You can almost call this literary festival a subtitle translation from Indian languages. What are your thoughts about the status of translation, specifically from Telugu and from other languages? What are your and what is the
future?
Future of translation.
Yeah.
Are there many translations being done from Telugu literature?
Yes. So there's a fair number of translators, and in fact, some of the Telugu writers themselves have done the English translation of their own work. Some successfully, some not so successfully. And one of the reasons, and I don't mean any, I think the quality of translations has improved a lot in the last 10 years. Before that, you know, they were, I won't even say adequate. Some of them were whatever they were. I don't want to dwell on that. But I think in the last 10 years, the quality of translation has improved a lot. And I think there's been a conscious effort to focus on translations. And, you know, as we saw, this is the first time that the International Booker was given to a translated work, The Tomb of Sand, which was translated from Wraith Samadhi. And Daisy Rockwell, she was here. She was the opening session. And also in India, there is this prize called, I think it's the JCB prize. It's a British prize. And in the last 5 years, 4 of the prize winners were translated works. And this time, all the shortlisted works are translated works. And so I think people are turning away from, I won't say turning away, but I think people have realized the limitations of, well, not even limitations, of Indian writers who write in English because they have such a different aesthetic, such a different voice. They talk about such different things. And I think people have realized that it's important in order to have a representation of all the different subcultures, regions. It is important to have high-quality translations. And so there's effort now not only to fund these high-quality translations, there's more systematic and there's programs for that. And so I think the quality of translations are improving, and I think the future is wonderful for translated works. As a start with the series that Aleph has, of these various languages. And I think that has been very good, because now I'm able to read stories in Tamil, Marathi, Goan, Odia, Kashmiri. I wouldn't have been, okay, some of us speak 3 languages, 4 languages, but it's impossible to speak all the languages in the world. So I think the future is bright.
There is a perception among the Western English-speaking countries that Indian literature is mostly in English, because of this hegemonic imbalance
Yes.
of English language publication. So that's another reason why translation should be encouraged and should be read. And not only that, you were talking about your son, people like his generation,
Yes.
who are likely to have lost touch with their native tongue, can only read about their heritage
Yes.
through English language.
Yes.
And that is another reason why translation should be emphasized and encouraged.
Yes.
The person that I have translated, a prominent writer in Kannada, you are Anantamurthy, who is himself a professor of English, he made a conscious choice of not writing in English. He could have done that, but he did not. In fact, he even went as far as saying that if I wrote in English, I would be making a concession to the Western market. I don't want to do that. Even his Kannada writing, he said, I don't even want to write in Kannada with a view to be translated. That itself will affect my writing. So that added to the challenges of translating him, because he was completely against any kind of making any kind of compromise in his writing. So you had to know his milieu so well in order to make an authentic or nearly authentic translation of English. So I'm glad, and I'm sure you share with my views, that translation are becoming more known in the Western world.
Yes.
You were talking about the Tomb of Sand. Mm-hmm. I have the dubious distinction of being part of the Man Booker International Prize in 2013, when it was just then introduced. And Anantamurthy was one of the finalists. As his translator, I was part of that ceremony. Yeah. But he didn't. And look at that. At that time, although translation were beginning to be considered for the award, the prize went to the English writer. And then it took, about 13 or 20 years, 15 years, for the first time for an Indian language writer to be recognized in translation. So we have come a long way. Question? Yes, please.
It's really fascinating to hear how you collaborated with your dad. That's very inspiring.
Thank you.
The story of how you came to translation. So just curious to know, have you done translation before, or is it something you discovered just now?
Oh, in the last 20 years, I had not translated anything. Maybe I translated, some of my, grandmother's letters or something but very casual. So it all started when my dad came to live with us 21 years ago, and it has been there ever since.
What has been, have you had any response or reaction to this translation itself, this book?
Yes.
From the Indian writers or other translators?
Yes, so almost every writer who was featured in this book we have received, messages from them saying that, how happy and how pleased they were with the translation and how well it matched with the vision that they had of their book. And now, of course, we are kind of keep getting requests, please translate this story. So I get probably 2-3 stories every day that, could you please translate these for us? Yes. So, and also they spread the word, right? So these writers are now kind of ambassadors, and they go in, so I'm approached by young writers who say, hey, I'm a friend of so-and-so, and they said, I read the translation of your story, it's amazing, do you think you could help me translate this? And they're all written in Telugu, by this way. So one nice thing about technology, about WhatsApp, is that they can type all these things in Telugu, and I can read them. So I think that has been actually amazing, that they're actually able to do that.
Please, yes, this lady, please.
Do you do self-publishing, or how do you publish your translated works?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Self-publishing, or how do you publish your translated works?
So the translated works, this was published by LF. And so it's funny that the way this happened. So our first anthology was published by Rupa. And so around a couple of years ago, we got a request from a lady called Minnie Krishnan, who is a very famous translator. And she was doing the thing for Oxford University Press,
Yes,
I think.
yeah.
Yes. So she said, we need a permission to reprint one of your stories that appeared in that Rupa publications. It was called The Spade. So I said, fine. And then I think she actually spoke to David Davidar, who's the editor of LF, and she said, you need to talk to these people. And so they said, we are looking for the Telugu version of this series. Do you think you could do it for us? So we said, hey, sure, we have like a stash of around 27. So this is a continuing process. So my father and I, he keeps finding stories and translating them. So we are kind of constantly sitting on a stash of them. So we told them, hey, we have these 27 stories. We kind of looked through them once more, polished them, we sent it to them, and they picked up 21 stories. So in the beginning, when we started this Literary Voices of India, which was an online magazine, right in the very beginning, that was online. And I think the Rupa people kind of saw it online, and that's where that came from. And then so it was like a chain reaction that happened with that. Yeah.
Please.
I had a question about, in the spirit of translations and reaching a wider audience, maybe for both of you. It does help reach, let's say, an audience like your son's generation who wants to keep in touch with this culture, but does not read the language. So, have you considered, or what are your thoughts on, let's say, keeping the language, but in a different format of audiobooks, where you can still retain the original language, but reach an audience that can still, verbally understand the language, but does not have the same.
You mean like the audiobooks of Telugu books, for instance? I'm sure they must exist somewhere. I mean, I haven't looked into that, because for me, I like reading. I can't hear. I have a attention span problem, so unless I see it in front of me, my attention wanders. So I haven't really looked into audiobooks, but I think that's a great idea.
In fact, the series called the Murthy Classical Library of India, which Harvard University is bringing out, each volume is a bilingual edition. On one side is the original language it's written in, say Kannada or Punjabi or Hindi, and the other side is English, corresponding English translation. So for those people who have minimal proficiency in reading, they can read both in the original and English translation. That is the...
Transliteration, so the original language,
Yeah.
transliteration,
Correct. Yes.
Both, yes, yes, yes.
Yes.
This young lady. Murthy Classical Library of India.
So I just want to kind of add a geeky addendum to what Narayan said, is that India has one of the biggest repositories for this translation, because literally you have 3-4 languages of the same document, Hindi, local language, English. So for, this translation, information retrieval, text,
Yes. Yeah.
they're in heaven there.
This young lady, please.
I write fiction and also teach fiction in a writing program in Oregon. And I have a question. I've been trying to introduce more translated literature, and I'm curious whether these writers writing in Telugu and other regional languages, do you see the influence of the West in their writing, in the aesthetics? I would like students to see different aesthetic styles.
Right. So that's actually a very, very good question, and it's something that motivated this, is that these stories are very different, very authentic. They're not to say that those influenced by Western influences are not authentic, but these speak to issues and speak to incidents that would not cross our path in a more westernized. So I'll give you an example. There's a story called Predators in this book, and that absolutely bowled me over, because this is set in Vijayawada, which is, not exactly the hinterland, but it's about these two, I don't know what to call them, but it is the extremes to which human beings are driven by poverty. So what these guys do is the Krishna River flows into these canals, and there's this canal called the Raivis Canal in Vijayawada. And so these canals have these locks to kind of control the flow of water. And what happens is very often, there are a lot of suicides, especially women. They come to take their life, they jump off the Krishna bridge into the Krishna River, and their corpses get washed down to these locks. And so these guys, they wait until they see a corpse floating in the body, and and they immediately jump in and they take away whatever jewelry, because most married women will definitely have a Mangal Sutra or something, which are gold. And so this is something very specific to the culture, to the place. And those kind of stories, I don't know whether they will find their way into writers with a more Western or urban kind of upbringing, or as Narayan said, they're writing for a different audience, they're writing for a more urban audience. And there was another story about these political revenge killings in the Rayalaseema district. And that is also something very specific to that place and to that time. And that story, even though it's about a wealthy, educated family, but it's still very specific to that. And I think those kind of stories you won't find in more stories that are written for a Western. And I think it's absolutely essential and imperative to introduce those kind of stories and those kind of backgrounds, because we have such a rich literary heritage, and there has been such eloquent writing in local languages, and it would be a pity to lose that. And I think the key to that is a high quality translation that's able to keep the music, the rhythm, the tone, the mood of the original language.
Please.
So my question is more about what is the general status of how well cataloged is these stories, these literature in Telugu, for example? How much help did you have in actually discovering?
So that's actually a very, very interesting question. And full disclosure, is my former colleague from AT&T Bell Labs, so go science. Hence the technical question. So it's really interesting, because some of the stories, actually, as I said, we had to source them through other writers. They're not well cataloged. And some of them are just written on ruled note paper. Now, the nice thing now is, because of WhatsApp and Facebook and all these social media things, the writers they write it in paper, they take a picture and upload it, which has been absolutely amazing, because you can come across stories like that now, and it gives them a platform and some agency and the ability to get exposure. because earlier, I mean, they had no way of accessing any of this, the outside world. So that was actually very, so this is, but they're not well cataloged, and even these stories that we get, I mean, sometimes it's like a page is missing, and then you have to contact them and say, where are these things coming from? So cataloging and all. So there was actually so there was a gentleman, his name will come to me in a minute, but he actually made it his mission to kind of scour all of Andhra and find every book he could. So he built this library. I'm blanking out on his name right now, but he is the authoritative source of Telugu literature. He has like decrepit books where pages are falling out. In fact, we had to get one of the stories which was written by an old grand aunt of mine. We had to actually go to him to get a copy of that because her heirs, descendants, did such a poor job of, I don't know what they do with the books.
Preserving.
Yeah, preserving or carefully keeping them. Yes. Yeah, so some of these were not published actually. There are a bunch of them that were published and award winners, but some of the new writers, like towards the end of the book, they were not. So what they would do is they would typeset them and send us the PDF. So I think, if I remember correctly, there was one story here which actually came to us as a PDF, and they're not necessarily published. But I think that this has actually given them a lot more exposure and a lot more, because it's a well-known series and because it's a well-known publisher, they're at least now known across India, if not, well, now they'll be known in New York. So, not a bad place.
Wait, please.
My question is around, you said the stories are listed chronologically in your book. So when you trace or when you go through stories in the book, does it reflect the changing social times or times of Andhra society? And is that quite clear? Or is it pretty much different stories?
Interesting question.
Yeah, so definitely you do see the social norms and things. So for instance, there's an example of, in one of the later stories, there's an example of a father who's living with his son. There's this whole discussion of, old age homes. And so, I mean, the concept of old age homes did not exist even 20, 30 years ago. So that's one example. And you do see that. And you see it most starkly in the language, because in the beginning, the language is very formal, the conversations are very stilted. And you can see that there is a lot of informal language, dialect, and not only dialect, for example, words, informal words, and even swearing, and all that thing kind of creeping in towards, so it's a much more, Devi. Yeah.
Exactly my question too. So
Okay. Well, I can't claim to be a Telugu scholar by any stretch of the imagination. So the main thing was, both my parents only spoke to me in Telugu. They didn't speak to me in any other language. And we always had Telugu magazines and Telugu literature in our house. So we used to get weekly magazines. There were a lot of literary magazines. And there were publications so there were two publishing houses at that time, the Shalandra and Navodaya. And so they used to publish short stories. So they were always there. And my mother was a big reader of novels. And also my mother's brother, my mama, he's a best-selling historical fiction writer. So we had all his collection of books. In fact, one of his books was made into a movie in the 1960s. So we have all his books at home then. So it was more from just reading at home and my mother insisting that I should,
When you learned the script
My mother taught me. Yeah, script and yeah. Yeah, so it was, it was, I think,
But despite that, despite your response just now, how did you actually learn about the nuances of the culture? Did you go often to Andhra? Did you go to visit your native village often or live there?
yes, so we used to, visit Andhra like every year or so. And of course, my parents were, I think they took a lot of pride in, like my mother's family is from Guntur and my father's family is from Krishna district in Vijayawada. They are supposed to be, I mean, they claim, my parents claim, I have no way of verifying it. They claim that is the essence of Telugu culture, And so I never heard the end of that. So, and both my parents, especially my father, and I notice that now a lot more, he's like just a historian of culture. He's a historian of literature, of movies, of music. And since I was his only child, he'll keep constant, core dump of information. So it was all the time I grew up hearing these things about, oh, that writer, this, that. So I think it's like you imbibe it. But I really can't claim to be a Telugu scholar because most of my reading has been in the last 21 years and it has been all the stories that I've read. I've read some classics which my parents insisted I should read. But other than that, I think most of my Telugu reading and cultural imbibing has been of recent last 21 years.
Do you speak Telugu at home now?
I speak with my father. My husband is Tamil.
But let me hazard a guess.
Yes.
That your children don't speak Telugu.
Do you?
Because I know what happens to the generation. And hence the importance of translation.
Yes, absolutely.
I have two questions. One is technical, just translation. Do you find, how do you translate sort of conversations? It's very culture specific, and do you feel like if you literally translate it, you look awkward?
Yeah.
You have to add some color to it. So, how far can you stray from that?
Yeah.
So that was one question. The other question is, how did these short stories got published in Telugu over the last 100 years? Are they through magazine serials or because I don't know?
I can tell. Yeah. Yeah.
It was mainly through serials. So was it?
Yeah. So the first question was about how do you keep the cultural context intact? And so it's very important to be able to find the right idiom, because for every idiom, an equivalent exists in almost all languages. But if you were to kind of translate it literally, like a transliteration, it would be awkward and horrible. So you have to find the right idiom. And I think that's where being very fluent and conversant in both languages and both cultures is very important. And so I think that was actually helpful that I grew up in a solid Telugu household where people were bandying around all these idioms constantly, and every admonition from my mother would be with some idiom or some quote or some reference, So and to be able to find the equivalent of that in English is very important.
I remember you were using a certain expression. Sometimes we have to substitute an English idiom to a Telugu or Kannada idiom.
Yes.
You use a phrase called scraping the bottom of the barrel.
Yes.
Which I guess is not in Telugu.
Yes.
But you have used that.
Yes, and another one was, now I'm blanking out on that, but there's things which you need to, I'm blanking out on one, but anyway, you have to find the equivalent, of that in order to kind of keep the fluency of the language. And the second thing about publications was, yes, they were published in magazines. They were popular magazines as well as there were specific literary magazines called Yuva, then Bharati. So these were like very high-level literary magazines. Of course, all of them are defunct now. Nobody buys them anymore. But that was the medium of circulation of how these the stories were published.
The translation, it's a good example would be like eye of the needle versus the ear of the needle.
Yeah.
It's the same idiom. I mean, it's the same phrase, but in Indian culture, it's the ear, not the eye.
Right.
The needle is supposed to have an ear, not the eye. So when you translate it, you do.
Maybe in Tamil.
Yeah, even that.
Yeah.
Please.
My question was answered earlier. I was curious because I grew up here, but my mother tongue is Telugu. Our family's from Hyderabad. But Telugu is such a tender, beautiful language. And that nuance in English, I find very lacking. Even if you hear like a Hindi translation, it just falls flat. So I'm glad you addressed it. But I really just wanted to express a note of appreciation from someone who grew up here, who didn't read those stories, who had little exposure to them. And my Padma writes in Telugu, but I can't read it. I now Padma to my baby niece, so I'm so happy that I can now share stories with her.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah.
Well, if there are no more questions, we will adjourn to the other room. Maybe, do you have other copies that people
Yeah.
look at? And,
Yeah, with great prescience, I bought these copies from India. And, oh, that is a story in itself, Yes, how I got these books from India. Because of the war in Ukraine, they were not shipping non-essential things here, and I had to beg, and then we paid like a king's ransom to get those books here. Yeah.
Thank you. It's been
Thank
a
you, Narayan.
wonderful,
Thank you.
very
Thank you.
pleasant.
Thank you.